All right. Well, I am here to talk to two guys about uh, storytelling in video games because I know a little bit about video games, but I don't know too much about storytelling. We've got Matthew Stokes and Seth Bovey, both in the liberal arts department at the Louisiana State University of Alexandria. Do y'all want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Sure, I'll let Dr. Bovey go first.
Thank you. My name is Seth Bovey, and I'm a professor of English at LSUA, and I've been teaching here for 30 years. And my area of specialization is American literature, especially 19th century American literature. But I also teach courses in literature and film, and the novel, and myths, legends, and folklore.
I'm Matthew Stokes. I've been at LSUA about 8.5 years now teaching English. I have got my master's from Louisiana Tech, and on paper, my specialization was American literature, but I took courses kind of all over the map. I wrote my master's thesis on William Faulkner's Go Down Moses, along with Dickinson and Frost. I thought it was interesting. Dr. Bovey said he's been teaching for 30 years. I knew this talk was going to be about video games, so I calculated how long of my life did I dedicate to that, and it was exactly 30 years. So,
Oh, wow.
right when the NES came out. So we can get into that a bit later, but
So Dr. Bovey started teaching and you started playing around the same time.
essentially, and now we're both teaching. So yeah.
Cool. I'm excited to have two people on here that know way more about storytelling and the role of the author in telling a story, because I have questions about how this plays out with video games. Before I go into like my really critical question, so what seems to me to be what really distinguishes a video game as a storytelling medium from other traditional storytelling mediums is that it has autonomy and choice. You can do whatever you want. Is that actually unique to video games? Were there any precursors to that? Did any other storytelling mediums already do that to some extent?
Well, I know of one good example. Back in the 1970s, the series of books called Choose Your Own Adventures was beginning to be published. And in those books, the narrator addresses the story to the reader in the second person so that the reader becomes the protagonist of the story. And usually in those stories, there are about 7 different paths that the protagonist can take to get to different outcomes. And in some of the books, there are as many as 40 outcomes. So they do offer a lot of choice. But of course, the paths are all predetermined. And so the reader doesn't have complete freedom or absolute freedom, but does have freedom to choose these different paths and different outcomes. And let's see, those books have been called interactive and also game books. So there was some idea that they were like games in a way.
I'll kind of dovetail on that a little bit. I noticed and I know we're talking about literature and games, but as far as film goes, I noticed recently YouTube released a film where it's sort of the choose your own adventure thing. You watch a scene and you have to choose something and it takes you to a different part. So the film could have a different ending. But speaking of, choice, I know Dr. Bovey addressed the choice of the reader in the story, but I've been thinking about characters and their freedom to choose. And we can get into this a little later, but that's been something that I've always been kind of attuned to. There's certainly some stories where it's pretty clear the characters don't really have a choice. They're kind of just stuck in this predetermined script. And I don't mean the one the author designed, but within the story itself. So that's interesting, but perhaps we can come back to it.
Yeah, and something else, I think it was Dr. Bovey, we talked in the hall one day. I think role playing came up. That's not really literature. I don't know how you'd classify that. You're getting into, but isn't some postmodernist theater kind of getting into that gray area between literature and role playing to some extent?
I imagine if it involves improvisation.
Yeah.
So if the actors are free to improvise, then that would sort of be an undetermined narrative. And so the actors would have to work it out amongst themselves, really.
Well, I immediately think of Dungeons and Dragons, which has seen a resurgence in pop culture with Stranger Things. But in a sense, that is a form of storytelling. I think you have the dungeon master who plans out a few basics, but it's truly up to the players to kind of determine where the story goes. And so that does involve some sort of improvisation and role playing and decision making.
And it seems like role-playing games actually simulate the freedom that we have in real life more than video games would,
Mm,
as far as I can tell, because there are so many different choices that can be made that can cause the game to veer off in all these different directions. So it seems like there's a great deal of freedom in role-playing games.
yeah. And then, of course, you have role playing video games. And it's interesting how game designers try to bring that element, from a paper and pencil game onto a digital platform. And I think that certainly brings along some challenges, but again, more things we can get into in just a little bit.
Yeah, hitting on, so it looks like video games aren't unique per se. I mean, that is their main kind of bread and butter as far as storytelling goes, but they're not necessarily the only game in town, no pun intended. But y'all talk about predetermined paths I mean, how integral is that to a story, the idea that there is some planned path? Because I feel like at some point, a lot of games, you have some choice over some kind of trivial surface level options. But in a lot of games, the writers of the game or they're going to have you arrive at this climactic moment, and it's going to be resolved usually with a violent conflict, regardless of what you as a person wants to happen. And in general, it kind of challenges this idea of just having all kinds of forking paths and unlimited freedom. You keep going in that direction, it almost seems like I want to revisit the concept of a storyteller or an author or a story and ask, do these concepts still make sense if you've kind of just set up this sandbox of endless possibilities? What are y'all's thoughts on that?
Well, recently in one of my classes, we read a couple, and we're in the middle of our second novel right now. And this is something that's come up in class. Take a novel like A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, where Frederick Henry, the protagonist, is in World War I. And in Hemingway's mind, one could argue that the end result was already predetermined. He planned it. But I found an interesting bit of trivia. Hemingway rewrote the ending to that particular book, some say 30, perhaps 40 plus times, because he just couldn't settle on how he wanted to end it. And another aspect to this is, even though the book has been published and printed, so one can argue there is a definite ending, many of my students were unsatisfied with the ending and had their own ideas of, what happens next? What did the character do? So it's a couple of approaches there. Yes, there are this idea of a predetermined end, but not really. Depending on whether you're talking about the present moment or during the process of writing the story, or even after it's been written.
Yeah. And one thing that I would add to that is that nowadays we have a lot of fan fiction being written. And so fans are going back and sort of taking the scenarios from these pre-existing stories and then basing their own stories on other possibilities. So they're sort of rewriting works of literature and works of science fiction and that sort of thing, and sort of finding these gaps in the story and picking up with these characters and going off in different directions and creating entirely new stories based upon the same characters and scenarios and all that stuff. So I think fans sometimes want the stories to live on and go in different directions and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
So is that still storytelling if you tell a story and the person experiencing the story decides, I'm going to be the author now and I'm going to start telling and rewriting the story?
Yeah, in my freshman comp class, we read a memoir by Wang Ping, who went through the Cultural Revolution in China, and her memoir is titled Book War. And as a child, her greatest dream was to read fairy tales for herself. And of course, the revolution began and books were burned and schools were closed. But the point she gets to in the end is, even though I had to burn all of these books, I had this realization that I still remembered the stories. And so I told them to my friends, and I even told them stories I created. So absolutely, I think it's still a form of storytelling.
And that reminds me that oftentimes when people read books, they start playing around with the world in their own imaginations, and then they create their own stories, sort of using the original story as a springboard, and basically live in that world in their imaginations. So that's another possibility.
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll get there in a second, but I did have a comment about this predetermined idea in terms of video games. So I said I started playing them in the 80s around my 8th birthday, and the early games like Super Mario Brothers and what have you, the screen started off kind of on the left, and you had to keep going to the right until you got to the end of the screen, and that was the end of the level. So yes, in a sense, there was not really a lot of autonomy. Like you mentioned earlier, kind of different levels of decisions, like the small, mundane things and then the big things. But what was interesting is they would sometimes provide like these secret tunnels to warp ahead to another level. So some could argue that, well, that's giving the player a choice, but the end result was still the same. It just brought you to a later point in the game. But I started to notice, as the years passed, games sort of evolved. Like there was a game called Metroid, and the faster of the time that you beat it in, the main character removed more clothes, and she was supposed to be attractive space astronaut or something. So there was kind of a reward for playing in a different way. But then you get other games that have alternate endings, and we can talk about that more in a minute. So take a role-playing video game, for instance. If I make these choices, these characters will trust me and give me more choices to make versus something else. And so then you have the idea of alternate endings. But then finally, we have this idea of open-ended games where there is no end. There's things to do, but there's not really a main objective to achieve. And I find it interesting that people are still drawn to that sort of thing. So I began to think about the aspect of, okay, why did people want to play games in the beginning? I think it's because they were challenging and they were fun. So same thing with a novel, why do people read novels? Sure, they're entertaining, but sometimes they're challenging. What did the author mean by this and that? But today, a lot of these open-ended games, they're not really challenging anymore. It's more about just participating in the story. So, just a few thoughts.
Yeah. What do you think of the idea of alternate endings? I know we're kind of touching on, I've heard phrases like the death of the author and authorial intent, and y'all seem comfortable with saying, be free and do whatever. Don't worry about the author. But, if the author sets out and their story that they want to tell is, this sequence of events, A, B, C, D, and then instead of having an ending, a resolution to a conflict, they're like, well, pick one of these 5. That's the ending of the story as I intended as an author. Does that seem strange to you, or does that seem like can you see that as being a viable artistic vision to just kind of have this forking path at the end of your story?
Certainly not traditionally, I don't think. Dr. Bovey could probably speak to that a little more than I could.
Well, I would say that as long as all the alternative endings make artistic sense, then
Okay.
any one of them should be fine. But some endings are probably going to be more interesting than others and have more to say, I would think.
One novel that I've read a lot and taught a lot is falls into the genre of postmodern fiction, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And I like that book so much because it breaks so many rules. The author breaks a lot of rules. And most story arcs have a beginning, a middle, a climax, following action, and then the end. And Vonnegut couldn't do that. He was trying to write about the destruction of Dresden during World War II. So we have a complete lack of, I would say, a lack of a traditional plot in the story. But now that I'm hearing y'all talk about this, I even wonder, is there even really an end in that particular book? It kind of leaves all, actually he tells us in the beginning of the book how it ends. It starts like this, and it gives us a snippet, and it ends like this, and it's a bird saying "poo tweet." The ending of the book is not even an English word, right? So arguably there is no end. Yes, there's no more words following that, but does it bring closure to the reader? I don't think so.
I guess that story is about people hopping around in time and space. So it's hard to have a linear narrative or a linear path.
Yes, absolutely.
That's another thing I was going to touch on in the class is this idea of linearity. With most forms of storytelling, there's a very fixed set of experiences. But with a video game, it seems like it'd be hard to tell a story if the reader is allowed to reorder the experiences, or the main bad guy has captured the damsel in distress, so you want to run off and go rescue her, but you can stop and you could start a popsicle business and work for 5 years selling popsicles, and then at some point go ahead and go save the damsel in distress. Give all that freedom to the player.
A story within a story. And I've seen this in several novels, but certainly in video games, I see it, this idea of side quests.
Yeah.
I have this main objective and I can try to work at it if I want to, but if it's more fun for me, I can go off and gather all these materials and try to make a lot of money in the game, or I can do something else. And so I think players these days, at least for a lot of games, are not playing for that main objective, but they're living their own story within the larger story.
But those smaller stories are all narratives. So I guess we're still talking about stories within stories.
There was a book called Erasure, I think, written by Percival Everett. So the main storyline is this guy, the scholar in academia, he can't get anything published, a story, and he's talented, and so he intentionally writes kind of the worst book that he can think of, and immediately it's published and it becomes so popular. But we actually get to read lots of that book that he wrote, within the larger novel itself. So there's a story kind of within a story. And even back to Slaughterhouse-Five, there's a lot of references to this fictional author named Kilgore Trout.
Right.
And the narrator will frequently say, and another one of Trout's books is about this, and give us like a paragraph. So you have all these little rabbit holes that you can go down if you really wanted to.
And that is fun.
Yeah.
I know in Cat's Cradle, one of Vonnegut's other works, they talk about this Bokanon fella who wrote all these books, and there's excerpts, and I'm like, I want to read this Bokanon book.
Yeah.
Sounds amazing.
And I think with any story, that's one of the objectives, is to pique our curiosity and to spark our imagination, and get us curious and interested.
And see, one of those rabbit holes is something that a fan could go down and write a story about and create fan fiction for that part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have this kind of participatory interaction with the work. Yeah.
Right.
One of the things that I was thinking about earlier, I think somebody mentioned that one of the draws to playing games and perhaps reading novels, but particularly with games, is this idea of choice. You know, I get to make a choice, and with the choose your own adventure novels, you've kind of had that, but in games especially. But to me, it strikes me as interesting that there isn't really that much free choice because a game designer, a programmer, has curated this, and there's only so many options you can truly pick. So is that truly freedom of choice? You can't really work outside of that framework that's been created. And I
Right.
wonder what y'all think about that in terms of stories. You know, is there sort of, are we working within a limited framework when we, as readers or listeners?
Yeah, it seems like a video game would have a finite number of choices because otherwise the world would be so vast and so complex that it would sort of mirror the real world. And that would be very difficult to do in a game that's digitized. It would
Grand
just,
Theft Auto attempts to do that.
oh, really?
Yeah, but you know, in Grand Theft Auto, if you wanted to create a nonprofit to help with housing for homeless people, I don't think that's an option. Like you can steal a car from someone, many variations of that.
And this makes me think of something else. You know, why as humans are we drawn to this, even if we recognize it as an illusion, this opportunity to make all these choices? I think because there's no consequence. In a game, I can go beat somebody up or I can try to save somebody, and it's not going to affect me in real life, at least not in the ways that one would think.
Right.
So do you think that playing video games is a way to purge these urges that we have that may be sociopathic or antisocial or something like that, and to get them out of the system, so to speak?
Yeah, but I also see it as a way to explore. You know,
Right.
what if, like, there's some role playing games where you can take on a certain type of character, like a thief, for example, and I get to explore what would it be like to live life as a thief, to go around and sneak around and steal things. Um, I
Yeah,
think it's just another way of exercising our imaginations.
yeah,
Um,
that's a good point.
but purging, yeah, I think too. Work out some frustrations, so go kill some monsters.
Right. So what about the idea of conflict in video games? Does every video game have to have conflict in it, like a traditional story, or do some of them just sort of simulate a fantasy world or something like that?
I think growing up, you know, playing the early games and throughout the decades, conflict was integral. You would have mini bosses that you had to fight or take on, and then you would have the big boss at the end. But I think a lot of games have broken away from that, and maybe Mark can touch on that a little bit with some of his experiences of playing games. But some games, there's no conflict at all. You know, like what, Tetris or whatever. It's a puzzle, really, more so.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's Sim City. You just build a city, and I guess the story is that a city got built.
Now,
Yeah.
there's natural disasters that could happen and overpopulation in sectors that you have to address, but there is no central conflict. It's just kind
Right.
of an ongoing, potentially infinite loop. You know,
Yeah. Yeah, I think we touched on this idea that even in games that are more story driven, like not a sandbox game, not a simulation game, a game that's meant to have a narrative, uh, we kind of touched on this idea that there's only so many different ways for you to arrive at the end. And maybe at best, they'll have a few different alternative endings. But yeah, I guess I guess it just it seems odd to me to call that like having written a story when you go far in that direction and just say at the end of it, um, yeah, I don't care what these characters do or what happens. As like it seems like a weird thing for a writer to do, but as Dr. Bovey pointed out, as long as all the endpoints you can get to make artistic sense, and that's fine. Or you could be one of those artists that says, I'm not trying to make artistic sense. I don't know.
Yeah. I think I kind of see that. Well, you bring up a good point. Now that I'm starting to think about it. So I think with stories, that's our earlier form of storytelling. You had the oral traditions, and then people started writing things down, and then we ended up with short stories and novels. I think you, in most cases, you wouldn't have a story without an intentional end. And I think a lot of games do try to incorporate that story element. But to be completely frank, a lot of the games that I used to play, there were these cut scenes, right? After a level, it would go to the scene where the story would develop and progress. But I always wanted to skip past that part because I wasn't interested in the story. Really, I just wanted to play like the game part. And if there is any big difference in the two, for me, that would be it. It almost seemed like the story element in a game was take it or leave it.
Could either of you, if I told you I have a creative writing project I'm going to commission from you, and it's a story, I guess it would just be a choose your own adventure story, but there's got to be lots and lots of choices and endings and forking paths. Would you feel like it would be a challenge to take that seriously as a storyteller? Would you be kind of tempted to just, like, I don't know, go the pulp route and just make a funny, silly, like, who cares?
No, go ahead, Dr. Booby.
Oh, well, I was just going to say it would be a difficult assignment. I know that. It would
That's
be
why I'm paying.
difficult. Yeah, to come up with all the alternate paths and make everything make sense and figure out where to start the path and how to end it and all that. It would be difficult, but it would be an interesting challenge.
And I think what would be more challenging is not necessarily having extremely night and day endings, like, oh, in this one path this guy becomes a millionaire, but in the other one he's homeless. What would be more challenging, I think, is to have them a little bit more closely connected, but just slightly varied, and then you could go back and look at, all right, what choice set this person on this different path.
Right.
That kind of comes with the idea of alternate dimensions and the multiverse. And
right.
there was a movie recently, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which was really good, and I recommend it to everyone. But in all these alternate lives, she was almost kind of the same person, but just slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be the challenge in an assignment like that. It would be kind of easy, I think, to say, well, he finds a lottery ticket on this day and cashes it in. So of course he becomes a millionaire, but something different would be a little more nuanced, I think. But yeah, I think it would be interesting.
I think in a way that's exactly what a writer for a video game these days has to do. You're basically writing a choose your own adventure novel, but the actual sequence of events is kind of chosen by the player. And it feels like with some games that you really do have to try and write something that's satisfying, even though you can take all these different paths and perhaps reach different endings. So maybe the choose your own adventure genre was ahead of its time.
Absolutely. And for me, the alternate endings in games sort of always frustrated me, because I, as a player, wanted the main end. I was programmed to think that way. There was always just one end, the main one, the one the author originally intended. And that's the one that I wanted to get. And so it really kind of broke the mold. And I think for me, it messed with my mind a little bit to well, actually, it could end this way, and you have to be happy with that, and you have to live with that. But in a lot of senses, I didn't want that.
That's right. A lot of games do have a true ending. That's right. If you want the true ending, you have to do things the right way.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So games usually have some sort of preferred ending, or
Yeah, or they'll call it a canonical ending.
okay,
Because the sequel to the game is going to assume the previous game was resolved via the canonical ending. So if
okay,
you did it the wrong way and you play the sequel and it's not consistent with how you play the first one, that's a problem.
huh, interesting.
There's a game, well, it's a series of games called Fallout, kind of set in this post-apocalyptic nuclear North American landscape. And for each decision that you make, you have a karma rating. And like, so if you decide to blow up this town of civilians, your karma goes down. And for me, it became something kind of different. You know, the endings could be just so different. And for me, I wondered, was there, and I didn't know the term at the time, canonical ending, but I really wondered about that. Is there an ideal ending that the developers of this game planned, or was it intentionally just meant to be whatever it is, that's what it is? I never really came to a conclusion.
So a serious piece of literature written by a serious writer, and the writer says, basically, you can choose to be a complete jerk or a complete angel. And this is a real, I don't know, it seems so polarized and so simple, but I guess it could be done.
Hmm.
That's how games tend to dichotomize, like all your actions fit within these two categories. You either did something good or you did something bad.
Uh-huh.
Scooched towards the bad guy ending or scooched towards the good guy ending.
And I would venture to say most players fell somewhere in between.
Right.
You know, I'm sure a few tried to experiment with, let me do all bad things. And I would argue that I don't think they intentionally wanted to do those bad things, but they were curious to see what would happen if I did.
Uh-huh.
I found that I personally could never really play that way, even though I knew there was no real life consequences. It just didn't feel right. You know, I want to rescue this town. I don't want them to all be destroyed. You know,
You can steal candy from a baby, but that poor little cluster of polygons on the screen is going to cry.
but
It's going to emit crying sounds.
yeah, but it was interesting to me though that I didn't enjoy. I can say it like that. I didn't enjoy playing that way. Uh, but I doubt all players were like me. You know, some may have, you know, like we said earlier, let me purge these desires. Some may have enjoyed that aspect of it.
So in Fallout, is the point of the game to accumulate karma, good karma?
I would say no.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it's truly about, and it's been a while since I've played it, but I think there is kind of a storyline that you're trying to solve some mystery, but essentially it's about surviving
Uh-huh.
and just solving whatever the puzzle was. I can't remember what it is.
Adventuring around in the landscape.
Yeah, but along the way, you know, you can shoot a random person if you feel like it, or steal some medicine from some hospital if you feel like it. I mean, you can really kind of get way off track, and I think that was intentional.
Then your karma rating will go down.
Yeah, that's right. And what's interesting, they were really smart in this. The lower your rating goes down, the responses with the non-player characters that you talk to change.
Oh,
Yeah. So if your karma is low, then some people may not want to talk to you at all.
uh-huh.
And then you have limited options then in what you do moving forward in the game.
Well, that's clever.
Yeah. And you know, if you think about it in real life, it's kind of similar. If you have a rap sheet this long, you can't go get any job you want, right? There's consequences.
Right.
So
Yeah, if every time you go to the liberal arts office, they slam the door and shut the the drapes. Maybe you need some better karma.
Yeah,
I
that's right.
guess. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, well, so may I ask you, Mark, kind of grand scheme, what were you thinking in terms of this discussion? What were you hoping to discover and to learn?
I wrote down a lot of great notes, and I wanted to wrestle with this idea of an open-ended narrative with multiple paths and multiple endpoints. How's that a story? That seems strange to call that a story. And I don't know if we've exactly resolved that with a definitive answer. I don't know if it could have a definitive answer, but I think we made a lot of progress in deepening, at least I deepened my understanding of the the kind of conceptual confusion around it. I hope my
Yeah.
students get a similar vibe.
Well, I think too, a simple takeaway that I was at least reminded of is stories evolve.
Right.
What makes a story has not always been the same. And of course, we see that with fiction,
Mhm.
with the traditional narratives versus ones that are all over the place. I think there are some recurring elements. You have characters, they have events that they go through and they make decisions. And in some cases, there's an end, but I think it's always, it could potentially evolve.
Do you think that a narrative should have some sort of a point, that the
Mm,
author should make some sort of point about life or experience or something like that?
Yeah.
Mark, or
Oh,
go ahead, Mark.
I was just saying, yeah, I think a narrative should serve some purpose. Like a joke should result in someone laughing, or if it's satire, making people mad, it should do something.
Right.
Evoke a response.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a type of essay that I teach called a critical response essay, and essentially the writer is supposed to respond to some element in the literature that they read. And I think it's hard to do that if there isn't a point to it. I mean, you could do it, but I absolutely believe that true literature, what is literature versus non-literature? I mean, literature sticks around because it has artistic merit. And I think artists, I had this discussion with my students. Yes, art is entertaining. Yes, novels can be entertaining. Yes, games are entertaining, but I don't think for true art that's the main purpose. I think there is a message that artists want to get across, and I don't always think it's just one message. It could be many things. Um, and finally, I do appreciate that message is not always neat and tidy and clear. Sometimes we have to struggle a little bit to get to it.
That was a really good note to end on. I feel like I'm just going to ruin things by talking more.
Well, thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for your time. Is there anything y'all wanted to add on before we wrap things up?
I wanted to ask you guys if you thought that games were a form of escape and that people want to be immersed in this world and experience whatever the world offers, as opposed to a work of literature, which we enjoy in other ways. I mean, we escape in literature as well, but we're also interested in gaining insights about human beings and uh, human nature and that sort of thing. So do you think the games are more designed to immerse people in virtual worlds and to give them something to escape into?
I I would say I think it depends on the person, and I'll explain that in a second. But I would say yes, absolutely. I mean, I hate to admit this in a recorded video, but many hours of my life have been spent sort of escaping into these virtual worlds, and for many reasons, pleasure, entertainment. But in some cases, when things are stressful, it's nice to just kind of shut it all off and to escape. But it's kind of funny. There's a passage in Slaughterhouse-Five where the main character Billy has come home from the war, and he's checked himself into a veterans hospital because he had kind of a mental breakdown. And his roommate has all of these science fiction novels, and Billy starts to read them, and the narrator explains that science fiction was a great help to Billy. Billy and his roommate were trying to reinvent themselves in their world. So I think literature can also be an escape. But if you forced me to choose one or the other, I would say video games probably more so.
Oh, that's coming from a English instructor.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so I think they both have the potential for escapism, but I think video games probably are designed more so for that. With some of the open-ended games, especially that we have these days, I was talking to some students and they mentioned a game called Minecraft, which I don't really know anything about, but they said you can do whatever you want in that game. You can build things, you can interact with your friends. I mean, it could potentially go on for forever. So that's an escape if nothing else is, I think. And I don't think that's a negative thing necessarily. Like all things, moderation is beneficial there. But
Yeah, and I'd add that with definitely they both can provide different kinds of escape. They're just good at one format's much better at one form of escape, and one format's good at the other kind. I think what video games are good with is, with a book, you could experience a sense of awe at a landscape that's being described, but the cognitive resources, you have to meet the author halfway and draw on your own experiences to create the mental imagery. Whereas video game, it's more like you can offload those cognitive processes because the game is just giving it to you right here. All the sounds, all the sights, don't participate. So it's kind of like I don't know, like a easy mode.
yeah, I mean, when you read, like I thought when you were saying that about, I think Dr. Bovey and I have talked about this before, but Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, for me, I'm going back through and reading that right now. It seems like half of the book is simply just descriptions of the landscape.
Right.
And that has to be intentional, I think. Yes, it's easy to get bogged down in and to skim over, but if you truly engage with it, you're being active, you're actively reading. Whereas with games, you get to shut that part off and just sort of zone out and go along for the ride.
Which might be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. This was great. I'm really glad my students get to hear from people who know what they're talking about when it comes to storytelling and all that. I really appreciate it. I guess y'all ready to adjourn?
Sounds good. Thank you again.
Awesome.
Thank you, Mark. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
It's great.
Very stimulating.
Send us the link later.
Yeah, that would be great.